G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Welcome to part 11 of One Crowded Hour, the biography by Tim Bowden of Neil Davis, combat cameraman. Part 11 in the partial book reading series, The Safest Place is in the Front Line, which as you can see is chapter 14. The reason I started this book reading series is because I want to discuss the stuff that's in chapter 22, which is Man Soup. And having commenced, I can't really justify missing out any of the stuff that's in the middle there. So it's just going to be a long book reading series. It's probably why I spent a long time resisting the temptation to commence it. But what can I say? Neil Davis filmed approximately 50% of the Vietnam combat footage that made it onto television in Australia, broadcast by the Australian Broadcasting Commission. I grew up in primary school during the Vietnam War. Everybody else who was in the Vietnam War spent generally less than 11 years in combat. Neil Davis's first footage from Vietnam came out in 1964. He covered Vietnam until 1975, and it was his serious belief that the safest place was in the front line. And this is how he explains it. It will be a two-part review of this chapter. Chapter 14, The Safest Place is the Front Line. Sound, sound the clarion, fill the fife. Throughout the sensual world proclaim, one crowded hour of glorious life is worth an age without a name. Neil Davis wrote the last two lines of this verse by Thomas Osbert Mordaunt in the flyleaf of every work diary he kept in Southeast Asia from 1964 to 1985. He said it was his motto and summed up his philosophy to life and combat. Sometimes the dangerous thought would occur to me that I had an immunity, that I was safe from wounding or death or being caught in any unpleasant happening. And that is a very dangerous assumption to make, because of course you are not immune. Whenever I got that feeling, I'd immediately stamp on it and be extra careful for the next few times and make sure that I did everything in my power and experience to protect myself. Sometimes when you are looking through your viewfinder, you get the impression that you're watching a television story and you're not part of it. Maybe you can switch off or switch to another channel. It's an extremely dangerous feeling. Yet despite conscious efforts to shake off the "it can't happen to me" syndrome, Neil Davis did have enormous faith in his own luck. Later in the war, his Cambodian friends called him Mian Sam Nang, the lucky one. Letter to Aunt Lillian, 6 May 1966, Hotel Majestic, Saigon. I managed to get to the Gulf of Tonkin off North Vietnam. This was very lucky and some kind of mix-up, I think. Since some American warships were attacked there in 1964, no correspondence have been allowed. I got there by a roundabout method and was less than 32 kilometres from Haiphong, the port for Hanoi, for over 2 days on an American frigate on station there to rescue American pilots downed over the North Vietnam. That is, of course, if they are close enough to the coast to ditch in the water. The frigate carries a helicopter for this rescue work. It was interesting, and fortunately for me, the Americans have securely closed all the loopholes for those correspondents trying to do the same. So it made my film the only one to be shot in the Gulf since 1964. Donald Wise was with Davis on that chancy assignment. The two men were winched down to the rescue ship after a 90-minute full alert flight on a Sea King helicopter. They spent 2 nights on board, then their reluctant hosts arranged a chopper to pick them up. As Davis and Wise waited to be winched from the deck, the frigate's own helicopters started its rotors up for a short patrol. There was a sudden crash and shower of sparks, as a chunk of its rotor blade detached itself and spun into the bulkhead just behind where the two correspondents were sitting. "Jesus," said Wise, "it nearly got us." "No, old fellow," said Davis, "it nearly got you." The remark was only partly in jest. Davis later admitted to addiction to combat and to his heightened perception in adrenaline-charged moments. He instinctively felt that the fragment of rotor was not going in his direction. BBC's Brian Barron said that Neil Davis had the best jungle instinct of any journalist he had ever met. Davis believed that his survival in combat could be rated at 10% luck and 90% experience, allowing for the fact that combat was never the same twice running. "I was always optimistic and took the soldier's view that it always happened to someone else. And it always did, although I was wounded on a number of occasions. It's rather like learning to drive a car well. There's always the fool that might come out and do the wrong thing, but I felt the more experienced I became, the more chance I had of staying alive." Now, many people hold the opposite view, that the more times you go into a dangerous situation, the odds are greater that your number will come up, that you will be killed. I didn't subscribe to that. Every time was new, and my chances of survival increased with my experience. But Davis also put great emphasis on instinct, or a sixth sense, that he felt civilized man had largely lost. There's a famous clairvoyant in Holland called Le Creuset, who doesn't claim to be able to predict the future, but he has a natural instinct for knowing what has happened. The police sometimes use him when they are trying to trace missing people. Sometimes the people are dead, and Le Creuset can visualise that. He has a feeling about it. He's a very simple man, and he lived with his widowed father, who I think was a woodcutter or rural worker in a cottage in the forest. The most plausible explanation for his success is that he has never lost that sixth sense, that instinct caused by living close to nature. Davis believed that playing the survival game for long periods reactivated an instinct for life. It was that reserve force that a desperate jungle animal may draw upon when hard pressed by predators. It knows instinctively the right moves to make. There is a great feeling of accomplishment when you recapture that, and the addiction comes when you keep testing it. It's amazing how many times you are right. Soldiers under extreme stress sometimes sensed that state of intense awareness in others and immediately followed the man they thought was hot. They're happy for you to have that electric feeling because your instincts might be working more powerfully than theirs on that particular day. Sometimes you will see Vietnamese soldiers going a little slower and looking apprehensive, much the same as a nervous dog when strangers are around, and there'll be a definite feeling that something is about to happen. It often does. Sometimes Davis was with a Vietnamese unit searching villages in a communist-controlled area. It might be the fifth or sixth village before the feeling was generated, for no apparent reason, that the Viet Cong soldiers were there. They almost invariably were. Davis experienced this phenomenon powerfully one day in 1967. He was south of Saigon with an ARVN unit commanded by his old friend Captain Long, the man who had taken him on his first combat assignment. The battalion was advancing across open paddy fields towards a tree line ahead. Several hundred metres to the left was a small clump of trees which seemed unlikely cover for the Viet Cong, as it was isolated and easily surrounded. Normally, I would have been concentrating on the tree line about half a mile ahead, but I had the very strong feeling that this clump of trees was dangerous, and I kept glancing back to it as we moved past. Captain Long noticed this and laughed. "Ah," he said, "I see that you know." I didn't know anything, and I said I had a strange feeling that there were Viet Cong in that group of trees. He said, "Of course you are right, and they're in the woodland ahead too." The Viet Cong had expected the ARVN troops to attack the tree line first, and then the troops in the small copse would have counterattacked from the rear, but they had miscalculated. The instinct of Captain Long and his soldiers, who skirted around the smaller group and wiped them out. Davis actually felt safer with Asian troops, but sometimes his instinct would tell him not to cover a particular operation. On one occasion towards the end of 1964, before the big American build-up had begun, he went to cover a set-piece battle in a rubber plantation not far from Saigon. The several thousand ARVN troops involved had been fighting for 3 days when Davis arrived. The South Vietnamese troops were preparing to move into the rubber late in the afternoon as the sun was going down. I knew the light would be bad, that I couldn't get any film out for 36 hours or so, and I had an uneasy feeling about the operation anyway, so I didn't go. Next morning, Davis was helicoptered to the same area to film the 28 survivors of the battalion of 430 men he had nearly accompanied. The Viet Cong had ambushed them in the rubber trees, and the South Vietnamese Air Force could do nothing to help them under the tree canopies. Jim Bennett, an American television correspondent, says simply that the first time they met, Davis saved his life. It was at a hot landing zone in the central highlands of Vietnam. They were both trying to get a chopper out with film taken of one of the first major clashes between the South Vietnamese and North Vietnamese troops. A Chinook, one of the big double-rotor troop-carrying helicopters, came in to disgorge fresh troops and ferry out the dead and the wounded. Bennett and his crew were about to dash on board when Davis advised against it. He was alone, carrying a small Bell & Howell cine camera with a cassette tape recorder strapped to his belt, and he looked to Bennett like a soldier with a camera. After Davis had identified himself as a Viz News cameraman, Bennett asked him what was wrong with the Chinook. Davis said, "The bloody thing's a death trap. They're too damn slow, and the bad guys are shooting hell out of them." Bennett took the advice despite the Australian accent, and the Chinook left without them. It was some hours before they were able to get on one of the smaller, faster Huey choppers. When they got to Pleiku, they heard that 2 Chinooks, including the one they had let go, had crashed, killing all on board. Dinner and booze were on Bennett that night. For Davis, the exhilaration of survival was a powerful aphrodisiac. When you have been to the edge and played your life against the odds and you've won, it heightens the joy of living and loving. Not just at the time, but afterwards. Back in Saigon, when I go out to meet people and eat in a nice restaurant, you have a far greater sense of what's good about life and how to enjoy and appreciate it. I liked to work alone because I didn't want to be responsible for the life of any other person. I felt I had enough to do just to stay alive myself. If I was tied by the umbilical cord connecting me to a sound man who was relatively inexperienced, I couldn't concentrate on my work and on staying alive. If you have to make a decision for yourself, right or wrong, you stand by that decision. I didn't wear a steel-lined flak jacket because it was too heavy and made me hot and tired. Besides, I had other things to carry like food and water and extra film. Davis refined his field gear down to a load of 20 to 22 kilograms. In the pre-videotape days, he used a handheld Bell & Howell camera with a clockwork mechanism to power 100-foot, 30.4 metre reels of 16mm film through the shutter. That gave a little over 2 minutes of film before the roll had to be changed. To capture sound, he had a small cassette tape recorder strapped to his belt. This was not synchronized sound and meant that the film editor back in London had to work very precisely to marry the picture with the recorded sound. It could not be used for a news interview, but was adequate for combat coverage. In less desperate circumstances, he used a bulky sound-on-film camera. The Bell & Howell camera became a part of me, an extension of my arm. Everything became automatic. By using this gear, I was much more mobile and able to get more worthwhile film. I would always go to the extreme front line to film. The main reason is that's where the best spontaneous film is. And not only, but also, he had been using a handheld clockwork Bell & Howell since 1961 at least. Here he is with it in 1967 in the Mekong Delta. And here it is again in the Mekong Delta in 1967. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Here endeth part 11 of One Crowded Hour. Back soon with part 12 to conclude the safest place is in the front line. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.